Moving on, going into the early modern period, just saying a little bit about the background of this period, 1600 to 1868, the Edo period, the Tokugawa period as it's known. This is a period, warring states are over with. It's a period of peace, a period of continued urbanization. So those castle towns, many of them grow into major cities. Most of the major cities in Japan come or had their origin as castle towns. So Tokyo is one of them. Tokyo by, or what we call Edo in this period, by 1700 has a population of 1 million people. So it's quite a large city. Edo is a time of peace, time of urbanization. The early modern period is also a period of somewhat political unity. There's a shogunate on the one hand, and then there's all these warrior domains. In effect, what happened is the warring states period where all these warlords are fighting each other, it gets frozen. And warlords have their territories and can keep them, but there's one warrior government that sort of oversees everything and is responsible for foreign policy and major countrywide decisions. There's still an emperor, there's still a court, they're in Kyoto, but they don't do very much apart from being the emperor and the court in Kyoto. And as I said before, Christianity is banned. The Portuguese they leave, the Spanish they leave, and the only Westerners are the Dutch, who, along with the Chinese, are down in Nagasaki. The Chinese, they get to live on land. The Dutch, they live on a man-made island and have very limited access to the rest of Japan, but they're there. They're there to trade with the Japanese. And they also, they do bring in sugar. They continue to do that from China. They buy a lot of Japanese porcelains. And so it's fascinating. All the porcelains in Europe come about because they're emulating Japanese and Chinese porcelains. Could tell you a whole lecture about that, maybe some other day. In the early modern period, the government wanted to divide society up into 4 status groups. We don't call them classes because classes sounds too much like Marxism. And status group is a bit easier, a little more accurate to talk about in terms of what these groups are. There were samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants, and a good way to remember this is spam, the spam system. So on the top of society were the samurai, then the peasants who worked the land, and then number 3 were the artisans who create things with their hands, and at the bottom rung of society were merchants. So you can see this is something that samurai created. They put themselves on top. They are the ruling elite, and they get this idea from Confucianism, which becomes very popular in this period. They have a very agrarian outlook, and so they think, who's number 2? Well, it's got to be the peasants. Peasants who are 90% of the population. They're growing things that we need to eat, so let's make them number 2. Number 3 can be the artisans because they're actually creating things. And number 4, we'll put merchants at the bottom because all they do is trade. So it shows you something about the samurai mindset about making money. They are looking down at money making, although it's very, very important, obviously. Now, why is this important? It's important, one, for knowing something about society in this period, but also it's important for understanding food culture, because from the government's standpoint, there are sumptuary laws. How do you keep these groups apart? Well, you pass laws governing their consumption. And that's what a sumptuary law is. It's supposed to regulate in minute detail what people can buy. And that included all kinds of things. It included the comb you could have, the tobacco pouch you could have, the cake box you could use, the type of Buddhist altar you could have, all sorts of things. And it gets kind of ridiculous at some level. And I think the way a lot of these sumptuary laws work is the government would pass these laws, and then they would tell them, this is what you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to buy these things. Not supposed, or you can only buy this stuff. And that alone was often enough from the standpoint of the samurai. Okay, we've told you what to do. We've taken the moral high road. And then as long as peasants, artisans, and merchants weren't too flagrant about their violations, they could do things that they weren't supposed to. But if you got too wild about it, got too public about it, then you could crack down. You could be, the government might crack down on you. You might be made an example of. Now, a famous food-related sumptuary law was passed after a famine in 1643, and it said that, and this was directed towards the peasants, who are 90% of the population. They said the peasants, you're supposed to grow rice, but you can't eat it. You use the rice to pay your taxes. You have to eat something else. And if you're a peasant, you can't eat tofu. And if you're a peasant, you can't brew sake. And the fact is, you can't even buy sake. So you can see how harsh this law was. Harsh on paper, but in practice, there are no samurai living in peasant villages anymore. So in practice, probably, the peasants did what they wanted to do. They just weren't very public about it. So I'm sure they continued to brew sake at home. They just didn't open their own sake breweries in rural areas at this time period. But these sumptuary laws get ridiculous. So for example, if you're a merchant and you want to have a banquet and you want to have a multi-tray banquet, you're supposed to need a permit if you want to have more than 2 soups at your banquet or more than 5 side dishes. And according to sumptuary law, you can't have ginger until it's after the 3rd month of the year, the 3rd lunar month. So all sorts of minute details. It's kind of fascinating to study these and to know that they were publicized. Usually in a village, the village headman would be told about it, and the village headman would tell the rest of the villagers, or else it would be put on a sign. Same thing happened in urban areas. And you have to kind of wonder what people thought about that. And they probably thought, well, what the government doesn't know, it won't hurt them. I'll just continue to do what I want to do. And as long as I'm not too visible about it, nobody will catch me. But the ideal, at least from the samurai perspective, is they don't want merchants to show off their wealth. They want the peasants to focus on their farming and not eat all that good rice. And they want the artisans to toe the line as well. So these rules are definitely written from a samurai perspective. So speaking of the samurai and speaking of the peasantry, let's compare the diet of the two. We have the rural peasants and the urban samurai. And let me say something about that. Samurai get taken off the land in the early modern period. They live in cities. They live in castle towns. And so that's one reason why the peasants can get away from with so much, because they're the ones living in the countryside. And there's no samurai there. So who's to say that they're brewing sake discreetly or not? But in terms of what they're eating, peasants are probably eating 3 to 5 meals a day. Why is that? Well, they're working hard. They need to snack. They're probably constantly eating, constantly snacking, but maybe having 3 to 5 main meals a day. Samurai too, in urban areas, usually they're probably eating three meals. But we say meals, they're not like the breakfast, lunch, and dinner that we know today. As a matter of fact, these meals, if you're a peasant or if you're a samurai, it's going to be very similar. Each meal will be pretty much the same. So you're going to have a grain dish if you're a peasant. Maybe that's barley, maybe that's millet, maybe that's a little rice. If you're a samurai, you're having more rice, but you're probably mixing in other grains too. And then you're going to have soup with that, and soup with that, and pickles with that, and pickles with that, depending, that's all very much the same if you're a peasant or a samurai. If you're a peasant, you're living in a rural area, probably going to be using miso for flavoring. And If you're a samurai living in an urban area, you're going to be using soy sauce for flavoring. Peasants are having a little more gathered foods. They have wild herbs that they use that they've collected. Samurai might have a little more fish in the diet, all depending on where they live. So there's a lot of continuities. There's no real distinction between breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's soup and grain and pickles. Maybe if you're a samurai, you have a fish every once in a while, or maybe you have tofu every once in a while. Now, on special occasions, if you're in the countryside, okay, yeah, you can get some rice cakes. Yeah, you can have some noodles. Noodles are a luxury food, though, because they take time to make. You have to make them yourself if you're in the countryside, so it's not something you have very often. Noodles being wheat noodles, udon, or soba noodles, buckwheat noodles. And yeah, you're probably drinking that sake if you're living in the countryside. You're making it yourself. It's not as good in some ways as the store-bought stuff, but still, it gets the job done. Now, samurai are living in cities, so some of them are cooking themselves, but a lot of them are buying foods. They go out and they buy foods, or they're dining out too. There's lots of restaurants. I said earlier that Edo grew to a population of 1 million. Well, a lot of that population are men. They're samurai who are living in that city, and they help popularize the restaurant trade. And not just fancy restaurants, but a lot of like noodle stands and things like that are something that samurai are visiting, or buying prepared foods that they can bring home and eat. If you're a wealthy person, though, you might want to show off your wealth a little bit. And one way to do that is through conspicuous consumption. And you have to be careful about this because there are sumptuary laws that prohibit it. But there's this notion in the early modern period that if something is a first fruit, and what that term means is it's not just applying to fruit, it's when something first comes to market, there's a belief that it's healthy. It's a health food. So for example, the first skipjack tuna that arrives in Edo, the first one of the season, that will command a huge price. And a week later, the same fish will be 10 times less. And people could spend a lot of money on these, like when it first hits the market, the freshest food. And it's special not because it's fresh, but because it's like the first one and it's very expensive. And you even see this today in Japanese media, people paying enormous amounts of money for like the first melon of the year, to the order of sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. So this idea developed in the early modern period that eating something the first of the year was very healthy, and it's a way to kind of show off your wealth too. But be careful. You don't want to do this too much. You don't want to be too in the face of folks, because then you might be hit with a fine or imprisonment or something like that for violating a sumptuary regulation, because sometimes this was prohibited for commoners to do. Early modern period, we see the rise of a cuisine, a countrywide cuisine, because of the publication of culinary texts. I said in the last lecture that we have the first culinary texts from the medieval period. So the people who are putting together these elaborate banquets of many trays of food, or they're doing cutting ceremonies, these men of the knife, hochonin is what they're called. They're writing secret texts in the medieval period. Well, in the early modern period, we have the publishing industry. We have woodblock publishing. That takes off around the year 1600. And through that, we have the rise of culinary books, culinary texts. And now you don't have to be part of a secret tradition to get access to the information from a secret tradition. And there are cookbooks that are written for the general reader. So this completely changes the field of knowledge, not just for cooking, but for all kinds of disciplines. Things get popularized. People can buy books, or you can rent books from a local book renter. Now, culinary writings help spread ideas about cuisine, help spread the idea that food can tell stories. And in the early modern period, there are two basic types of culinary writings. There are menu collections that have various menus that you could reproduce. And then there are recipe collections that give you the directions of how to do that. Now, these are not like modern cookbooks in that you can't really pick them up and create them, at least if you were in the early modern period, because oftentimes they're almost like works of fiction. They show you the incredible possibilities with food, but they don't really promise that you could do this in reality. So the menus, for instance, might have foods from various seasons on the same menu. Or the recipes may not tell you all the information you need to know, but just give you some ideas. So in that way, the culinary writings are not just a way to train people how to cook. They're a type of literature, type of fiction, a type of way to imagine what you can do with food, which I think when you're looking for developing this idea that cuisine is a way of thinking about food, a way of telling stories with food, this fits right in. It helps popularize food storytelling. Here's a sample cookbook, one I'm going to mention and one I'm going to show you an illustration of. First, the illustration. This is what an Edo period cookbook would look like. This particular one is one that's associated with the Shijo school of cooking. So it's more of that old school, medieval, how to put together a multi-tray banquet cuisine. And this is something that ordinary folks, if they could afford it, could buy, and they could learn it, and they could copy those ideas. The cookbook collection I want to talk about, though, is by this author named Shoseki Ken Soken. And we don't know a lot about these cookbook authors in general. Oftentimes, all we know is their names. But this is a rather well-known cookbook. It's collected writings on cuisine and an outline on seasonings. Rori Momoku Cho Mi Sho, published in 1730. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you some menus from that, because this is one of those menu collections, and we'll see what those menus look like. So Shoseki Ken offers several different categories of menu. In his collected writings, he offers a very high-style Honzen multi-tray banquet. And then he offers sort of simplified versions of that. There's a 2-soup version. So the Honzen has 3 soups, and that would mean that each tray would have a soup. So that's 3 trays. And then there's a simplified version of 2 trays with 2 soups. That's the summer version. The autumn version is a kaiseki meal of 1 soup and 5 side dishes. I'm not going to talk about kaiseki today, but he has a simpler meal of 1 soup and 3 side dishes. So you can see a couple things here. First of all, the soup is really important because it tells you how many trays you're going to have. And also important are the side dishes. So we're dealing with kind of a structural approach to cooking. Let's just take a look briefly at some of his menus and what he suggests. So here's his aristocratic menu. This is the menu. What did he say? Let me back up a second here, if it'll allow me. Come on, go back. I think that's the menu for spring. Well, you can check, and if I'm wrong, let me know. This has 3 trays of food. So obviously it's for aristocrats. And also, if we think about sumptuary laws, you commoners are not supposed to eat litsue. This is something for the samurai, high-ranking samurai. This is something for members of the court. It's not supposed to be something for commoners. Commoners being peasants, artisans, and merchants. Now, of course, the irony is this cookbook is written for peasants, artisans, and merchants, more likely artisans and merchants, more likely merchants. And so you have to wonder, why would they be interested in this? Well, it's kind of like lifestyles of the rich and famous. It's like, how are the better half eating, or the better 1% eating? and what can I take away from that, and what can I do for my own banquets? So a couple things. I'm not going to go over this whole menu. If you want to read it, you can pause the slide, pause the lecture, and take a look. You'll note that each tray has a soup, and except for the fourth. And the fourth tray, we don't call the fourth tray. That's called the additional tray. And we don't call it the fourth tray. I have that in brackets here. It is the fourth tray. But we don't call it the fourth tray because four reminds people of death. And so it's always called the additional tray or something like that. And that tray has grilled foods. But for the exception of that, each tray has a soup. The main tray has pickles and rice and salts and pepper for flavoring, and then something that's very crucial, a fish salad or namasu, which is the ancestor of sashimi. So this fish salad is made with different kinds of fish. Take away the ginger shoots and the chestnuts and the kumquat, and you have a fish dish, and what do you have? You have sashimi. So namasu is sort of ancestor of sashimi. It's something you always see on the main tray. Here's a banquet that a commoner could eat, and we see a much more simplified version. Just two trays, each with a soup, of course. Main tray, again, has rice, also has a fish salad. This one has both fish and other kinds of vegetables and things like that, daikon, etc. All kinds of other goodies, and then looks like there's going to be a snack at the end, a separate soup and a separate snack, and maybe that's a way of getting around the sumptuary laws. You don't have a third tray, but you still bring out the third soup. You have to wonder if people thought that way. I do. Here's a fancier meal for commoners. Looks like one tray of food with the soup, rice, pickles. Always have those on the main tray, no matter the size of the meal. Soup, rice, pickles, you need that on the main tray. And then we have sea bream, some simmered foods, and then a separate soup and an unnamed snack that comes later. So you get the idea from that, the sort of structure of formal meals. Let's see how that feeds into the development of the restaurant trade. Well, very briefly, there might have been standing eateries in earlier periods, or there might have been roadside places where people could get something to eat. Some of them may date from the Warring States period, but certainly when we get into the early modern period, we have the rise of restaurants. We have places where people could go and have tea, for instance, in the 17th century. You wouldn't just have tea there. Maybe they serve light snacks. There are also full-blown tea houses, which are not about tea at all. Those are sites where you meet courtesans, where men meet courtesans. So it's part of the license quarters or the pleasure quarters. And then you have the development of full-fledged restaurants that develop. And here we have a restaurant on the banks of the Kamo River in Kyoto, woodblock print by the artist Hiroshige. So I'll talk a little bit about each one of these types of restaurant. First of all, in terms of elite dining, and these would be the ones that come from the tea houses in the licensed quarters. So prostitution is legal in this period, but it's restricted to special parts of town. And these parts of town don't just have brothels, they also have places where men can eat. And so really the first elite restaurants develop in these licensed quarters, such as Yoshiwara in Edo. And here, this is where, what would you eat if you went to one of these places? You'd have a multi-course meal in the line of Honzen cuisine with many trays of food. Or you might have a simplified version of just shared foods. That's another possibility if it's a little less formal. Here we're looking at a kitchen in one of these licensed quarter eating establishments, something from the late 17th century. Obviously, if you run a restaurant it's hard to prepare multiple trays of food. And so this gets boiled down maybe to a single tray. Or if you bring in all the food at once, the food kind of gets cold. And so by the 19th century, you have the idea that we should have just one dish at a time, served sequentially, and that's restaurant kaiseki cuisine. I'll say more about kaiseki when I talk about the tea ceremony, because there's also a tea kaiseki that feeds into this. But a restaurant kaiseki is something that's you could think of as a simplification of these multi-tray meals. And that happens over the centuries, so that by the 19th century, you have a more simplified meal structure. But initially, 17th century, 18th century, if you go to a restaurant, it's elite. In an elite restaurant, you're going to have a multi-course tray meal, the honzen ryori. So what if you're a lowly samurai and you can't afford to, eat out at the pleasure quarter? You still can eat out, and there's lots of opportunities to do that. One of them is the noodle stand. So by the mid 17th century, there are noodle stands in Edo selling wheat noodles, udon, soba noodles, buckwheat noodles. And these are open all the time, day and night. For a few coins, you can go get a noodle dish. What if you want to bring something to eat at home? The noodles you stand in the street and eat, but there are also these boiled food stands. And we see an image of one here. It looks like the guy's got some fish, boiled noodles, boiled food stands, but also sell all kinds of boiled foods. That could be potatoes, that could be tofu, that could be devil's tongue, or what's called konnyaku in Japanese. And his sign says that everything is the same price. It's 4 copper coins. It's kind of like the Dollar General of the day, except it just has boiled food. You can select what you want, you can take it home, and you can eat it. And so there's a proliferation of these smaller restaurants all over the major cities. By the end of the early modern period, every block has either a noodle stand or a full-time noodle shop selling soba noodles. So soba noodles are really the ramen of the early modern period. It's ubiquitous. And besides that, there's all kinds of other types of restaurants. There's restaurants that do sushi, that do grilled eel. There's all kinds of sweet shops that are available, shops that sell crackers. There's a huge number of different types of foods that are available from food stands and restaurants that develop in the early modern period. So early modern period is really a time for booming growth in cities in the restaurant trade. I guess it wants me to look at the slide a little bit more. Come on. Keep going. Those foods that I just mentioned, here we have soba or buckwheat noodles. Now, in this example, the foods are the soba is served on a mat, and then it would be dipped into a sauce, but other times it could be served in a broth. We have sushi. Now, sushi is a very ancient dish. It goes back to the 8th century, but the idea of making hand-rolled sushi or hand-formed sushi, what we call nigiri sushi, with just the rice ball and fish on top, that is something that develops by the 19th century in Edo, early 19th century, as do sushi rolls, and both of them are fast foods, as is tempura, a fast food, something that you would buy on the street, eat on the street, and you go about and consume, and you continue your day. So what about people eating at home? What are they eating at home? Well, we have a wonderful record for that by a guy named Kitagawa Morisada, who had an eye for recording facts about daily life. So he's one of these few individuals who tells us what's going on in the food world for this period. And he wrote a book called, actually a series of volumes called Morisada Manko. The title's not important, but what he tells us is very interesting. He tells us about what people are eating in the major cities, and it's like what I said earlier. The diet is basically rice or with a mixture of barley, soup, pickles, and side dishes. And well, to quote Kitagawa Morisada, he writes, "In the mornings, it's rice with miso soup. For lunch, it's cold rice with a side dish of vegetables or fish. And for dinner, it's pickles with tea poured on rice." So the takeaway from that is people are making rice or rice and barley once a day, and then eating it cold for lunch, or and then reheating it with just by pouring hot tea on it for dinner. Why do you only want to make your rice once a day? Because it's labor intensive to make rice. Also, you have to use up fuel to make a rice, and it's kind of a pain. So you make a lot of rice early in the morning, and then you can have it all day, and then the next day you make fresh rice. So what's the takeaway? Well, daily meals are kind of boring, aren't they? So Morisawa, he mentioned some side dishes, and here we have, if we want to know what those side dishes are, well, someone came up with a ranking of the best side dishes. And the way they did that is they used the same kind of ranking that you have for sumo wrestlers. They use this today for sumo. The top guys, the top wrestlers are at the top of the ranking, and then you have lesser wrestlers at the bottom of the ranking. This is called a sumo banzuke, and in the Edo period, it's a very playful time. They decided to make a sumo ranking of ordinary or everyday cooking methods. And we have that text. Here it is. It dates from 1830 and it was created in Edo. So what are those dishes that are on the ranking here? We can see if we look at the ranking, and I won't ask you to read it because it's all in Japanese, but on one side there are fish dishes, and the other side there are vegetarian dishes. And so the top fish side dish in this ranking is sardines, followed by shellfish, followed by shrimp, and then you can pause the slide, pause the lecture if you want, and you can see what other kinds of top fish dishes there are. Now here are the top vegetarian dishes. So the other side of the ranking has the vegetarian dishes. One side we have the fish, vegetarian ones. What's the top vegetarian dish? Well, it's tofu. It's called 8-cup tofu. It's tofu that's been simmered in a broth of water, sake, and soy sauce. Why it's called 8-cup tofu, it's just kind of a gimmicky name. It's basically simmered tofu. Number 2 is simmered kombu. Number 3 is fried burdock. What you take away from here is how kind of ordinary and mundane these dishes are. We do not see tempura in this list. We do not see sashimi in this list. Oh, there is a sashimi, but it's a vegetarian sashimi. So daily foods for people are rather plain. Lots of simmered dishes, some fried dishes, but by and large, it's either grilled or simmered and some frying. And very kind of humble foods too. And this is a continuity in the diet up until, the 1950s. So we entered the modern period in 1900, but for a lot of people living in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, their diet is really similar to the diet of people who are living in the early modern period. So here's a person born in 1950 describing their diet. What are they saying? Well, our daily meals consisted of pickles and miso soup, boiled soybeans for breakfast, boiled vegetables and grilled fish for lunch. Dinner was fried vegetables, simmered dish, or some fish, or vegetables poached in soy sauce. Sashimi was something we had as an occasional treat. So in other words, it really sounds like the diet of that Mori-sama was describing in the early 19th century. Lots of continuities in the diet. So that wraps up the lecture, and I hope you got something out of it. Here are some sources that I used for this lecture from my writings and one co-authored work. A later lecture will talk about food in a later period of history, the Meiji period, modern period, but I hope this gives you a context about some of the culinary trends that are happening in early modern Japan. Thanks for your attention. And if you have questions, please contact me and let me know.